Today I'm at Pewtor on the west side of Dartmoor. I'm staying in Tavistock for a few days, and Pewtor is a mile or so from the town, so it's a really easy drive to get here and get my quick fix of landscape photography. I want to talk about foreground interest. I think it's something that a lot of landscape photographers are fixated with, and of course we don't need to have foreground elements in our compositions when we're shooting landscapes, and I'm not going to talk about the reasons why not today. I want to focus on what I believe are the three main reasons why we include foreground interest in our compositions. The first one is actually because we found a fairly mediocre image and we're trying to add something to it to make it interesting, kind of like putting lipstick on a pig. And we've all done this. You have, I've done it. I continue to do it. I might even do it today. The second reason is probably the most popular reason, and that is to create balance in our composition. Let's say our focal point is top right of our frame. Maybe we want to find something to put bottom left to create some sort of balance diagonally. And we can also use elements to create sort of a bit of a leading line to take people to the focal point of the shot. When we're creating balance with foreground interest, it's important to get the proportions of the foreground and the midground or the background correct, so they're not fighting with each other and there's sort of a visual hierarchy. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The third reason is we include something in the foreground to help enhance our story, to help give the viewer more information when they're looking at the composition. And a good example of that is actually Dartmoor, because we've got these fantastic weathered, mossy rocks, granite rocks. So if we're shooting a beautiful tour in the background against a nice dramatic sky, it's nice to include a bit of foreground interest, one of these rocks, because that gives us more of a clue as to what it is we're looking at, what the landscape is made up of, and appreciate all the detail in the granite. It's actually coming over rainy again, so we'd better get moving. What drew me to this composition was the symmetry of everything, the two large boulders at the bottom and how the eye goes from the water straight up to the top of the tour. But of course it's way too busy, there's so much going on, just one big heap of rocks. As a shot, it didn't quite work, but there's something interesting there though, don't you think? This is an example of a fairly mediocre shot of a stack of rocks with no foreground interest. Now if I move the camera back to include some foreground interest, does it make it a better shot, a nicer composition? Is it better balanced? Is there more of a story now? Well, I think there is because of the ancient marker, but is it a better shot? I don't know. Again, like the last, we don't have separation. It's a bit better balance, you could argue, but yeah, nothing special. I think this might be a case of another fairly mediocre shot with some foreground to try and make things a bit more interesting. Although the detail on the rocks, the nice green lichen, does help tell a little bit more of a story, to give you a clue of what these wonderful rocks in the background are that we're looking at. And also there's a nice colour, complementary colour thing happening here. We've got the green lichen on the rocks, which complements beautifully with the rusty dying ferns. So that's quite nice. So we might be able to make something of this. The thing worth noting with this composition is the size of the foreground in relation to the size of the background. They're both fairly large elements in the frame. Sometimes our background can be too far back and the foreground can dominate and the background gets lost, particularly with wide angle lenses. And it can work the other way too. you can have a very small foreground that doesn't really do much, and the background is dominating. But it depends again on the story that you're telling. I'm really liking this shot, even though the foreground interest is pretty large and it's over to one side. There still seems to be a bit of balance. That little rock on its own there in the ferns is doing its job. Overall, I just love the complementary colours more than anything else, and the texture in that rock as well. It's fantastic. I'm really close to this rock because I'm creating a sort of leading line with it. And very dramatic. I'm low. I'm actually focus stacking. I'm taking 4, maybe 5 different frames, focusing at different points because I want to try and get everything in focus and really show the layered sort of texture in this rock, which echoes nicely with the tour itself. But I'm also going to try one shot with the focus on the foreground and blur out the background. Nice shallow depth of field. I do like those shots. I was trying something adventurous here by putting the camera so close to this foreground rock. I love that rock. I love the texture, the lines, the fact that it points towards the stack in the background. But the shot is a bit of a failure for me. It's not working because, well, those 2 rocks in the middle, they're not really adding much. They're just adding some confusion, if anything. There's a dead zone center left. So overall, it had potential, but not quite. This one though, by shooting shallow depth of field, focusing on the foreground rock, it actually works a lot better for me. Sometimes foreground interest can be really handy to help frame a composition, and in this case I think it works really well. Despite the rock in the foreground being so large and the interest in the background being so small, it just somehow works. For me anyway, it just works. And there's a little bit of a story there. We can see the weathered rock, the texture and the colours. I like this image. Here's another shot with the foreground interest being the focal point, the main interest, and the background playing the supporting role. I really like how this shot's working. I think it's because the tours in the distance are sitting nicely on a third. The rock in the bottom left is acting as sort of a leading line pointing to it. Overall, yeah, this is one of my favourite shots from the day. I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure about this one. It's very symmetrical. We've got three stacks of rocks, and then we've got these 2, and it's all very, symmetrical. Kind of works, but it's not quite doing it for me. That rain front is coming in pretty quick. I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna take it. Why not? I wasn't quite sure when I was framing this one up, but now I'm looking at it on screen. I rather like it. I like the symmetry. I like the balance between the foreground and the background. There's some nice separation with the rusty ferns. There's a little bit of story in that texture, those weathered rocks. It's giving a clue to what those rocks in the background are all about as well. Yeah, it's not a bad shot. This was the last shot of the day, and it was starting to rain very heavily. The idea was to take 2 shots, one to show you really bad balance and one to show good balance. This, of course, is the bad balance because the foreground rock is way too far over to the right. It should be over to the left. Kind of something like this. Can you see how much better that is? It acts as a leading line too. It had potential, but we'll never quite know.